So 1 year ago, it was exactly the 14th of October, I began a series of seminar lectures which made up a kind of a synthesis of the philosophical work that I've been doing during the last 5 years or so. And today I wish to, hopefully, this was to the benefit at least of some in the audience. Today I would like to do the dual thing, namely to show in what way I have benefited from being here in Paris. Because there is a certain problem, namely the problem that you all have seen, which makes up the title of my talk, which have occupied me for some time. And about 2 years ago, I reached a point where I realized, no, unfortunately, I can't get to the bottom of this because I would need the help of experts of a kind that we simply do not have in Sweden. And for some reason, I knew on general grounds that such people are present in France, in particular in Paris. So I thought that when I got this chair, that now I will really try to use the opportunity of finally getting to the bottom with this problem, namely the problem of where we have the logical term judgment from. Well, the question, how did judgment come to be a term of logic? That question has at least two presuppositions. The first is, of course, that the primary sense of judgment is the juridical one, which is older than the logical sense, and that the logical sense is somehow connected with the juridical sense, although in not so exact a fashion, perhaps. So this presupposition I take to be unproblematic. The other presupposition is, of course, that judgment is a term of logic. And there I could well imagine protests from those who have been educated in the way many of us have during the area in the history of logic that has been dominated by the metamathematical paradigm from the 20s and onwards. Where did we find the word judgment at all in our textbooks? Nowhere, I would say. To the extent that the term is at all a term of logic presently, it's because I started to use the term in connection with intuitionistic type theory in the late 70s. Since then it has become a standard term in computer science logic, let's say, used not only in connection with my system of type theory, but in connection with other systems that as well that develop logic on this level of judgments rather than on the propositional level. So the reason I introduced the term was that I needed some term that made a good contrast with proposition. And what was there available? Well, there was Frege, who had a clear distinction between Urteil and Satz, which is to say judgment and proposition. And there was Russell's rendering of it in English already in the Principles of Mathematics from 1903. He did not use judgment himself. He used the term judgment in his discussion of Frege. But the term itself, he skipped in favor of assertion. So either assertion or judgment, and they make a good contrast to proposition. And So I had a choice. I must have had a choice. Should I take assertion or judgment? And I clearly took judgment. And there are, I think it's mostly a question of your affinities, your logical or philosophical affinities. Certainly the term assertion is now the accepted term in Anglo-Saxon philosophy, especially analytically oriented Anglo-Saxon philosophy. And Russell certainly replaced judgment by assertion in order to make a break with the preceding well, British idealism in the first place, but also German idealism and with the German tradition in general. So he chose this excellent term, assertion, which came to be the winning term in this part of philosophy, at least. But on the other hand, one may have the wish to not to break with tradition. One may have the wish to show that there is continuity. And during the whole era of modern philosophy, from Descartes up to Frege and Husserl, let's say, the term used for this was judgment. And when I say for this, I mean for the things, when we reason stepwise, and in each step we have already established certain things, and then we take an inference step, make a step of inference step, and reach a conclusion which thereby becomes established through that step. So what are these things called that we step from and to when we make our inferences? Well, the term during this era in philosophy was judgment. We know Descartes used judgment in the Meditations, for instance, particularly in the third meditation. He did not write any logic, but it's fair, I think, to consider la logique de Port-Royal as the Cartesian logic. And the Port-Royal logic is divided into 4 parts. Des idées, du jugement, du raisonnement, de la méthode. So there we have in the second place already du jugement. And there remains the interesting question if this order is the right one in our eyes, but that's not the topic for this lecture. This was the Port-Royal logic, and if you look at Kant's logic, for instance, it has the same structure, von den Begriffen, von den Urteilen, von den Schlüssen. So again, in the second place, judgment. And Frege I have already mentioned. This was simply the accepted term during a period of around 300 years. But as with so many terms in the beginning of modern philosophy, in Descartes in particular, they were not entirely new, but they had a scholastic origin. And that is the case also with the term judgment. Now, if you go back from Descartes, what is most easily accessible at first is Occam's logic, because it's well edited. And it's easy to check that the term judgment is not used at all in Occam's logic. But on the other hand, in some other writings of his, he has a beautifully clear distinction between the actus apprehensivus and the actus judicativus. That is, the act in which you apprehend the proposition versus the act in which you judge it to be true or possibly false. So there we have at least the actus judicativus, and that is already more than 200 years earlier than Descartes. Sorry, more than 300 years earlier than Descartes. And then if you proceed backwards, another philosopher which it is easy to check because of the availability of good dictionaries is Thomas Aquinas. And there indeed it's easy to see that he used the term judgment, and moreover he contrasted the judicium verum sev rectum with the judicium falsum sev erroneum. So he clearly felt a need to use, if propositions are the truth bearers, that is, propositions are the things that are true or false, he felt the need of using some other term in connection with judgment. So judgments are either right or correct, maybe better in English, either correct or erroneous, as opposed to propositions being true or false. And this terminology was taken up and very important for both Bolzano and Brentano in the 1800s. There is a book posthumously edited by Brentano, Die Lehre vom richtigen Urteil, for instance. There you have this notion of richtiges Urteil. And I take it for granted that the reason, their source was Thomas, because they were, after all, both of them educated Catholic priests and had presumably been through this in their priest education. So now we are back in the middle of the 1200s. How to get further? Well, that one step further happened in the following way, that the last 5 years of my teaching in philosophy, I simply taught the organon in order to read the organon properly myself. In 5 years we reached up to and including Analytica Posteriora. And for each of the parts of the organon, I naturally used the Aristoteles Latinus, which is an excellent help, and where you can see how the various logical terms were transmitted or translated into Latin. And in particular, I did so in the case of the posterior analytics. And there the situation is the following, that unlike all the other parts of the organon, which were translated by Boetius, and we have access to the Boetius translations, in the case of Analytica Posteriora, he also translated it, that is known indirectly, but the translation was lost. And this means that it had to be retranslated in the Renaissance, in the 12th century. And so there were translations by Jacobus Veneticus and a certain Ioannes, whose name, whom we know nothing about except his name, essentially, both in the 1100s and in Italy. And William of Moerbeke worked over the Jacobus translation in the middle of the 1200s, 100 years later, but that's a rather minor change, making it more up-to-date. So from that point on, we had new Latin translations. But in addition to these, this volume of Aristoteles Latinus contains a fourth translation, which looks very strange. And this fourth translation is by Gerardus Cremonensis, that is the most distinguished translator of Arabic of the Toledo school. And the reason why it looks strange immediately is that it was the translation was made from the Arabic into Latin and not from the Greek original. And nevertheless, Lorenzo Minio Paluello, who edited this volume, he included it among the Latin translations, and moreover made a considerable amount of work on it. And one thing was that an index was collected for precisely this translation. If you look at that index here, you see that here you have judicium and judicum. And moreover, Minio Paluello has marked them with a star, which is just to indicate that he thought that these were especially worth noticing. He also has intentio here, for instance. Well, this, of course, immediately caught my attention. What is this? Judicium, if you count the number of occurrences, the plus sign means that there are more than one. You will see that there are 13 occurrences of judicium and 19 occurrences of judico in this Latin translation of Aristotle, and I knew perfectly well that there is certainly no krisis, which is the Greek corresponding to judicium, not a single one in the whole organon. And judico the same. Crino in organon, no. You find some single occurrence in the de anima, but not in the organon. We have some influx here, quite clearly, of judicium and judico from an original which we know to be Arabic. And that meant that I was unable to proceed further with this for the obvious reason. What I could do was to check these places, 13 plus 19, 32 places. I could check them against the Greek original. And that already gives some information, which I have collected here. Right. So if one just asks outright judgment, what is the corresponding, what term does Aristotle use for this concept? If one has read the organon, it's clear that what ought to correspond to it is apophansis, as it is introduced in the Interpretazione, where you have the most occurrences, and then you have in addition 3 occurrences in Analytica Posteriora. So that means at least we can look up these 3 occurrences in Analytica Posteriora and see how they correspond to what we have in Gerardus Cremonensis translation. And the outcome is the following, that in 2 of these places we indeed find judicium, the 2 first ones. You find judicium in his translation. And in the second place, but that's only one place, but sufficient to show that indeed judicium corresponds to apophansis here. In the first place, it's tricky because, well, you immediately see that you have judicium there, but it doesn't correspond to the apophansis in the Greek. Rather, it's the hen katenos in Greek, one thing about one thing, which is to say the predicate about the subject. It's that which has been expanded in the translation into scilicet judicium unio super aliud. So judicium here is an addition which has nothing corresponding to it in the Greek original. But at least it is a place, this 72a, 8 and 9, where you have judicium in the translation and where you have apophansis in the original. And then in the third place, on the other hand, there is simply no judicium at all here, although you have apophansis in the Greek. And that is because of the multiplicity of manuscripts. So in most of the Western manuscripts on which our texts are based, you have apophansios here. But there is one manuscript, the one that is called little n, which is as early as any of these manuscripts from the 9th century and is in the Bibliotheca Ambrosiana in Milan, which in many, many places gives a better reading than the standard Western manuscripts. So presumably it's from a different manuscript tradition, I would guess more Eastern, naturally. And in this particular place, it has antiphasis instead than apophansis, which is to say contradictio instead of judicium. So there is, and it gives better sense in this case, in this passage. So there is nothing mysterious about this. It's simply that this Arabic text that Gerardus translated clearly was based on a Greek original which follows N here. But at least we have now established something, namely that judicium indeed translates apophansis. But there is a mystery then that remains. Even if we are generous and count these as two places, and not only one, there remain 11 places of judicium in the translation without any base at all in the Greek. And then for the verb judico, all the 19 places lack any lack the corresponding Greek verb. And if you look at all those places, you will see that what Aristotle writes is just say. I mean, one of the one of the three Greek possibilities that you have for say, lego, eipon, phemi, and it's this which has been translated by Gerardus Cremonensis into judge. So it's a quite significant step that has been taken there. Well, so how to proceed further with this? Well, clearly, someone who can read the Arabic is necessary. And there are such people here. And I've been helped by Ahmad Hasnawi with this difficult point. And so we have to find the Arabic text to begin with. Well, it turns out that here already Dominio Paluello did great work because there is the standard Arabic version of the Analytica Posteriora, which forms part of the Baghdad Organon, which, by the way, you have here in Paris. For a long time it was the only copy. And maybe this is one of the reasons why there is such strength here in this area. So this is the standard translation. And Minio Paluello naturally began by comparing Gerardus Cremonensis' translation with this standard Arabic version and found that, no, they don't agree at all. It was full proof. So his conclusion was that there must have been a later translation, unknown to us, which he called the anonymous translation. And what is more miraculous is that he was able to establish that the same anonymous Arabic translation served as a basis for Averroes' Commentarius Magnus on the Analytica Posteriora. And he was able to show that although the Arabic version of this Commentarius Magnus was also lost, he only had access to the Hebrew version of it. But that was enough for him to establish that, yes, indeed, Averroes must have used this same translation as Gerardus Cremonensis. And then, maybe 30 years ago or so, the Arabic version of Averroes' Commentarius Magnus was eventually found, almost all of the first book, which means that now, since the commentary is written in the usual commentary styles with the lemmata, which are just verbatim taken from Aristotle and then comments after that, means that in the form of these lemmata we now do have the Arabic text. So we have two translations to compare with. The standard translation, which was made by Abu Bishr. Maybe I should say something about the times here. If you look there at Abu Bishr, you see it's late 800s, early 900s. So that's the Abu Bishr translation. And then we have this anonymous translation, which we now know that Gerardus translated. And of course, eventually it all derives from Aristotle. Now, comparing of Gerardus' translation with these two Greek versions and with Aristotle gives, fortunately, a very clear result, a very clear answer. So first of all, we have these one, or if we are then generous, two occurrences of apophansis in Aristotle, which corresponds to Gerardus' judicium. The answer is simple. Both translations have the Arabic hukm, which is judgment. There is no problem in translating hukm because everybody agrees that that is judgment. And moreover, I should say that, well, I did say in the beginning that it occurs, apophansis occurs primarily in the De Interpretatione, and there again, we can see that it was translated by hukm in the Arabic translations. So that is clear. But then there is the question, what about these 11 occurrences of judicium which have no counterpart in Aristotle? So there is a discrepancy there. Where was it introduced? Was it by this anonymous translator or was it by Abu Bishr? So in this case, if one looks at the text, it turns out that Abu Bishr has there normally something with kaul, which means saying or sentence if you want, but saying most literally, although there is nothing in Aristotle. And this was changed by the anonymous translator into hukm. So saying was changed into judgment. So we have discrepancies in both steps here, namely that Abu Bishr introduced something which wasn't in Aristotle, and that is clearly, or seems clear to me at least, just because of Aristotle's very compressed style, you feel the need to insert some words somewhere, and that was his choice. And then you have, so we have a discrepancy here, and then this is the interesting discrepancy, the passage from saying to judgment. And then we have the judico, which, as I've already said, I had checked that corresponds to one of the Greek words for say. And Abubishir quite correctly translated that as say, I mean the Arabic for say. And then it's again this anonymous translation which introduces the discrepancy, namely he simply changes this to judge. So this summarizes the result of this investigation. Now one can try to interpret this in as innocent a way as possible or as interesting way as possible. I mean, the innocent way would be to say that apparently this anonymous translator felt a need of making clear that say doesn't mean just utter the words. You should also mean what you say. And when you mean, when you utter a declarative sentence and mean it, you make a judgment. So it shouldn't just be the uttering of the sentence, but it should be a judgment. That would be an innocent way of interpreting this. But I tend to think that it's more interesting than this and reflects some kind of development. And this is for the following reason. Of course, there is no chance again for me to settle this question. I'm just proposing two alternatives here. And to settle it, one would have to read these two translations in extenso and get a general impression of what change it is that took place between them. But the more interesting way of explaining this would be that there is a very significant fact in the development of not only of Arabic logic, but of logic as a whole that took place around 900, namely that when Aristotle's logic reached Baghdad at that time, in the late 800s, then there was already an indigenous grammatical tradition which was very strong. And this logic, Aristotle's logic, was felt as some kind of intrusion on this territory of the Arabic grammarians. And this was so tense or such a big thing that even a public hearing or a public discussion was organized in the year 932 between the Abubishir, whose name you have there, who represented the Aristotelian logic, and the most renowned grammarian of the time. And Abubishir's, so it was Abubishir who was under attack, so to say. And Abubishir's defense here was to think up the following formula, namely that grammar is about expression, but logic is about meaning. We would say now logic is about the meaning structures, or I guess we would say logic is about the semantical deep structure as opposed to grammar, which is about the surface structure. And this is certainly something new in logic. At least I don't know of anything of that kind in Greek logic, something new. and something which undoubtedly had to do with the fact that whereas Greek logic and philosophy was a monolinguistic endeavor, they were faced with the difficulty of simultaneously having to deal with many languages, at least Greek, Syriac, which formed the intermediate between Greek and Arabic, Syriac, Arabic, Persian, and maybe even more, but this is quite sufficient. And so this idea of having a so to say, language of thought, underlying language of thought, or dealing with the meaning structures, which then have different manifestations in the various languages in the usual sense of language, could hardly arise except in this polylinguistic situation in which they found themselves. And then, if you look at this in that light, well, it looks like a transition from the verbal to the mental, if you take the judgment to be the mental counterpart of assertion. So that is another possibility here, much less innocent than the other one. And I have one little place of support for this, or rather one place where you see the same kind of transition from say to judge, and this is in Al-Farabi's commentary on De Interpretatione, and it happens to be from the 9th chapter, the sea battle chapter, but I just want to show what takes place. So here is Aristotle: for there is nothing to prevent someone from saying of something that it will be in, say, 10,000 years, while someone else says that it will not, and so on. And when Al-Farabi discusses this, he says there is nothing to prevent someone should have deliberated on something and come up with a judgment, or judged that it will be in a very long time, and that someone else should have deliberated on it and as a result come up with a judgment, or judged simply that it will not. So you see, you have the same passage here from say to judge in Al-Farabi's text. These are certainly these are texts which were certainly known to subsequent logicians. So to sum up now, what is the conclusion? Well, the conclusion, no, let's see, I have one more thing to say here. We have now looked at the Arabic phase of this question and seen that indeed the term judgment, hukm in Arabic, was introduced as in order to translate Aristotle's Apophansis. But as I said a moment ago, the translation didn't go directly from the Greek into the Arabic. There is an intermediate Syriac phase. The Arabic translations were made from Syriac, not directly from the Greek. And hence there is the question, if we go back to this Syriac phase, do we find the term judgment already there? We know that we don't find it in the Greek phase, but it could possibly have been in the Syriac phase. And so again, we are in the right place in Paris, because here there is the what seems to be the foremost expert on the Syriac transmission of Aristotle's logic, namely Henri Gonard-Roche, who has provided me with the necessary information about the Syriac phase. And so the, the picture that we arrive at is the following, that we have the Greek apophansis, Aristotle's apophansis, which is the origin. And it was translated directly by Boëthius into enunciatio, and that we know because although his Analytica Posterioria translation was lost, his De Interpretatione translation is there, has been there all the time, and their apophansis is translated by enunciatio, so we may take for granted that the three occurrences in Analytica Posterioria was also translated by him by enunciatio. But what happened in the Syriac? Well, this translation of Aristotle into Syriac began very soon after the Boëthius translation, later in the 500s, by Proba in particular, or Probus in Latin. And there apparently was no term for this, for apophansis in Syriac, so what to do? Well, you must introduce a word that corresponds exactly to it. And they just transliterated it into apophansis. So it's nothing but apophansis written in Syriac as well as you can. And it remained that way during this whole Syriac phase, which is a period of 300 years, when Aristotle's logic moved from Antiochia and arrived in Baghdad in the late 800s, so a period of 300 years. But clearly then there is no judgment during this Syriac phase. It's just a transliteration of the Greek. So the judgment appears when the Syriac apophansis was translated into Arabic, and that is known in the case of the Interpretazione to have been made by Ishaq ibn Hunayn. So here. So generally, I think we have all heard about the translators' school in Toledo in the 1100s, because they gave us the Arabic science and philosophy. But there was a similar situation in the 800s in Baghdad, namely that they got Greek philosophy and logic in particular, and science, through translation. So there was a translation school in Baghdad at that time, whose most prominent man is Hunayn ibn Ishaq, who is the father of this school. And in this, concerning these particular texts now, where you have judgment, namely De Interpretazione, it's known that Hunayn himself translated it into Syriac, and Ishaq ibn Hunayn, his son, rendered it into Arabic. Which means that we also know approximately when this took place. And that is the moment when the term judgment appears. His choice of hukm to render the Syriac apophansis, which is just Aristotle's apophansis. So we have then reached this point. And then that was in turn translated in the case of analytica posteriora by judicium in the Gerardus translation, and so we got it into Latin. So this is itself an interesting phenomenon, that we have had two transmission ways of Greek logic and philosophy in general, namely the direct, or let me stick to logic, the direct transmission to the West, which is through the Boetius translations, which in this case gave enunciatio. And then we have the other transmission way, namely going east in this Syriac tradition for 300 years, and then living in Arabic for another 200 to 300 years, and then reaching us through the Toledo translators in the middle of the 1100s, which is to say a bit more than 600 years later than we got enunciatio. So we got two terms for one and the same term in Aristotle. And what happens in such a situation when we have two words which ought to have the same meaning because they come from the same source? Well, either one of them dies. This is a kind of linguistic law, which I don't know the name of, but two different words with exactly the same meaning, they don't survive beside each other. It just complicates communication to have a change all the time. So one of them dies, or else a meaning difference is developed between the two and they both survive. And in this case, I think it's the latter that happened, namely that judicium came to be reserved for the mental act of judging, whereas enunciatio was for the verbal act of assertion. In French, you are happy because you have enunciation as a living word. In English, it has died. Enunciation is impossible for us to use now, so assertion in English. But in French, the best is to stick, I guess, to enunciation. So this meaning difference has developed, one for the mental and the other for the verbal. And this, in fact, goes back already to the Arabic time, because although the term hukm was introduced, as I said, as the first translation of apophansis, very soon afterwards, namely with Al-Farabi, in particular with the text that I just showed you, his commentary on the De Interpretatione, he did not stick to the hukm translation, but rather changed it into Qadiyya, which was a term that was chosen already in the very first Arabic logic from the middle of the 700s by Ibn al-Mukaffa. Second in this. There. So since Al-Farabi chose this word instead, it meant that he get the two terms here, hukm, and in addition to Qadiyya, and hukm we already saw in the passage that I showed you, that he used in his own discussion of Aristotle's text, and used it in very much the same way in a way that is, to me at least, indistinguishable from the way we use judgment in our tradition. I judge it to be sunny today and such things. So the distinction in Arabic that you have between qadiyya and the hukm is essentially the same as the distinction that between enunciatio corresponding to qadiyya and hukm to judicium. So this is the result of my investigation concerning judgment. And let me then just say at the end here that, well, that immediately suggests that we have a similar pattern with respect to another difficult logical term, difficult as regards its history, namely proposition and premise. Because in that case, proposition is the Latin translation, Boethius' translation of Aristotle's protasis. And we did not get the term premise until the latter part of the 1100s. So it's just a fact that Aristotle had a word for conclusion, namely symperasma, but there was no special term for premise in Aristotle. There was the term for protasis, for proposition. But and how did we then get the term premise? Well, we got it because protasis was rendered into Syriac, and in this case in two different ways, and I need not comment on the second one here. I could do that in the discussion if so. But to begin with, it was just transliterated as protasis, and this was translated into muqaddama in Arabic. And then finally, although not by Gerardus Cremonensis, but by, there were many translators of Arabic into Latin in the second half of the 1100s. And in this case, Prantl refers to a certain pseudo-Averroes. And I've also checked with the translation of into Latin of Avicenna's Metaphysics, and in both cases you find premissa as a rendering of the Arabic muqaddama. So muqaddama. So this is how we got the term, the important term premise. But one origin, and two different ways producing two different terms, and there it's maybe even more clear than in the other case that they both survived because there was a great need for the notion of premise, and survived by developing a very clear meaning difference. I mean, there is no way of mixing up proposition and premise in present-day logic. We all know the difference. So this is the result of my investigation, and when reaching this final conclusion, Henri Huguenot Roche very kindly provides me with two reprints of his, which are about Gerardus Cremonensis and what we owe to him in the way of logical and philosophical terminology. And in both of these two articles you find the following formula, which is to say that Gerardus Cremonensis gave us judicium, which corresponds to the Arabic hukm and the Greek apophansis. So the conclusion that I have reached is not new, but well known to the real experts, but it has not reached as far as the circle of logicians, not even the historians of logic. I mean, if you think of Niel's History of Logic or Bochensky's History of Logic, this information is certainly not to be found there. So at least I hope with this to have contributed to making this knowledge more widespread. Thank you.
We have time for questions and remarks, of course. But first, I'd like to ask a trivial one, and perhaps later on the different. The first question is, would you try to root, please, briefly, the notion of judgment into intuitive type theory to this frame present?
Yeah, so as I said in the very beginning, in type theory I had a need for a term, a good term, that contrasted well with proposition, namely for the things that we demonstrate and that we reason from and to in a demonstration. So the question was simply what term to choose. And what was strange was that there was no such term in the logic that we have all been taught. So I had to look back, as I said, to Frege and Russell in this case, because after the First World War, nothing new, no new suggestion came. And then the term was judgment in Frege, and Russell rendered it assertion. So I could have chosen assertion just as well, but I happened to choose judgment for the reasons that I said in the beginning. And by this choice, it has become a living term of current logic, although I guess one would say maybe no, it doesn't occur in general, it's just in certain circles around me, and in computer science in particular, that this has become the standard term. That is the situation. And it's not that there is something in this long history that I have been telling that is reflected in type theory. It's just that type theory needed a term here.
Yeah, I think I have understood what you said about the shift from the verbal to the mental area for the choice of vocabulary. But as you said at the beginning, the word judgment is not really part of the mental vocabulary, it's more part of the judicial vocabulary, juridical vocabulary. So there is another shift to explain here.
Yes, so the shift from the juridical to the logical, I agree. And I could add something first in connection with that, namely that when apophasis was rendered into hukum, judgment in Arabic in the late 800s, as far as I know, there was no mental connotation at all to that, because after all, judgment in its juridical sense is the public act of declaring guilty or not guilty, and here it's true or false in the case of judgment. So no such mental connotation as far as I know. It's only when Al-Farabi took this step of introducing Qadiyya instead that we got a split between the verbal and mental. But so that was a side comment first. Now what can we say about, how have we arrived at the logical meaning of judgment from the juridical one? And I think it is because of what I just said, namely that the shortest kind of judgment is guilty or not guilty. That is, you have to make a decision between guilty and not guilty. And in logic, the traditional definition of judgment, which we should not stick to any longer, I think, because it's too narrow. But the traditional definition is that a judgment is an affirmation or a denial. That is, either judging A is true or A is false, where A is a proposition. So it's because of the similarity of that that the term became a logical term, as I understand it.
Yeah, because when you mentioned a tension between logic and grammar, I asked myself if, by any chance, there was a similar tension between logic and law.
Oh. I have not seen anything on this point. The only extra piece of information I can give is that I have been told that hukm in Arabic has the same duality as it has in our languages, namely it has both a juridical and a religious meaning, as it has for us with the Day of Judgment and such terms, in addition to the logical one. Or rather, it's the other way around. It's the logical one which is in addition to the juridical and religious.
So actually, it's a thought. So there are really three meanings of judgments. There is the juridical meaning, there is the logical meaning you just spelled out, and then there is the psychological meaning, the sentimental act. And that's something that may not have been present when hukm was used as a translation. Maybe in English there is a word that's interesting because it's a bit like judgment, but it's fairly not mental, it's more like assertion. That's the word pronouncement. So maybe hukm means something like pronouncement, which has all the properties needed for it to be used as a logical term, and that's also juridical possibly. So it's a decision that is made as to truth or falsity or something like this.
Yeah, so I know something about the choice of hukm because the translation was made from the Syriac, and you have both. We have not only apophansis, which I have spoken about all the time, but we also have logos apophantikos in the beginning of the interpretazione, which is in English, of course, the declarative sentence, and unfortunately declaration doesn't work for apophansis. One would like them to correspond, but if we say assertion and assertive sentence, for instance, then we would get a very good correspondence with the Greek. Now so we have both apophansis and logos apophantikos. I have already said how apophansis was dealt with in Syriac, but I've said nothing about the logos apophantikos, which was rendered in a different way as memra, something like this. And this is relevant for the choice of hukm in Arabic, because this so this renders the sentence, and this is the declarative sentence. And this is derived from a stem which gives it the meaning decisive or cutting. And I associated that naturally with the decision between guilty or non-guilty, or between true and false in the logical case. So for those who know the etymology of the Syriac and the Arabic, it's not an unnatural choice to go from this to hukm.
So one question I have is, when this idea of judgment has been something mental acts, just like there are assertions which are linguistic acts, there are also mental acts. When did this appear, this notion, this more psychological notion of judgment?
Yeah, that was...
It's not clear that we have that at all in the
No.
text that you refer to.
So that's why I put in this part in my talk about the reception of Aristotle's logic by the grammarians in Baghdad, because in order to defend or save Aristotelian logic, Abu Bishr thought up this formula, completely new to my mind in the history of logic, that grammar is about expression, but logic about meaning. We don't even have a clear word for meaning in Greek logic. I mean, something which is as canonical as mana rendered intentio in Arabic and Latin correspondingly. So that would be my... Yeah.
So I'm trying to connect what you told us about how Protasis got into logic with what seems to me to be the major application of that in the history of logic, which was, in analysis, the distinction between Protasis and the Apodosis. The Protasis being treated as something that was somehow given, the Apodosis being what was to be found. I didn't see anything in what you said that would explain that development. Did I miss something, or was it not there?
No, it was not there. My picture in this case was simply to give an explanation of how we got the term premise, just as I had previously explained how we got the term judgment. What you now say has to do with the etymology of protasis and propositio, namely that protasis is from proteno, which means hold forth. That was rendered by pro to pro and taxis to positio from pone. So put forth. This way, that was preserved somehow. Instead of pro, you have pre, but it's not a big difference. And instead of pone, you have metre or missa. So etymologically, they are very similar, these two branches, but on the other hand, they got completely different uses, two different meanings.
Yes, what gentleman's question before of the links between legal, juridical terminology and logical terminology was a very big issue in the early modern period, especially with writers like Arnaud, like the French logical tradition of the Port Royal. And especially in Leibniz and Spinoza, this becomes a very important issue, the connection between a certain art of judgment and ecclesiastical law and that as this sort of reform of the methodology of philosophy itself. I was wondering, and through the concept of judgment, of course, I was wondering what you think this Aristotelian tradition can inform us about that real refoundation of a kind of logical tradition or
So this is very interesting and sounds like a new research topic tied to the time of rationalism, roughly. I mean, Leibniz, Spinoza that you have mentioned. But in, I mean, the organon I know, and there is virtually no connection in the part that I have read between the juridical and the logical. That's likely to be older rather than Aristotle. And I'm unfortunately ignorant about Leibniz and Spinoza and the references that you give here, which sound very interesting concerning this point.
Do you think that your account of the origin of judgment from Apophanthes could enlighten or could raise questions regarding Husserl's apophantic?
Yes, certainly. I mean, when I myself studied Husserl long before I studied Aristotle, so I knew about apophantische Logik several decades before, and wondered why this strange term. Couldn't he have chosen something more palatable? But once you have studied Aristotle, well, no problem. I mean, apophantische Logik is the logic of the declarative, indicative or declarative. So that is one thing with the connection with Husserl, and another thing is, of course, Husserl's extensive use of the term judgment. It's really a central term in all of his work. And moreover, we know that he revived the concept of intentionality. That's when I suppose most of us first have heard an Arabic philosophical term when one explains intention as being the Latin translation of the Arabic mana. And on that point, again, one must say that it almost looks as if Husserl was a follower of the Arabic tradition about which he presumably knew nothing in making the concept of intentionality so central as he did to his philosophy.
Just maybe a little bit, I'll say, neighboring topic, but I think there is also interesting issue of translating analytic posteriori into Latin, and which concerns the pair of apodeicnomy and deicnomy, like demonstration and something like monstration, which
Yes.
maybe doesn't exist in English but exists in French.
Mm-hmm.
Monstratio or demonstratio. So I don't know if you did look for this pair of big words.
No, so certainly you have the substantive apodeixis and you have apodeicnomy, and as you said, as the verb, and only deicnomy also. But I don't know of any similar situation. I tend to think that is simple. That is, we have the Latin, we have only got one Latin term.
Exactly, but two Greek terms, and apparently Aristotle rather consistently distinguishes between the two, using apodeicnomy in more logical, precise sense of, say, demonstration, something which includes in the sense of syllogistics, and use this deicnomy is, in my sense, rather distinctive term, meaning a kind of epistemic justification.
No, so I think that was well captured in Latin with demonstratio for apodexis and demonstrare for apodecnomy and just demonstrare for decnomy.
I also wonder if there is these different sources, about which I didn't know actually, between first and second analytics, right? So is there, how to say, that problem that you just stressed now should be somehow visible, I think, if we compare analytica priori, posteriori. You know?
You mean what you brought up?
No, you mean, if I understood you correctly, the first analytics that we have Latin text, it just comes from Boethius, right?
Yes.
And the second analytica makes this one
Exactly.
way as you. And so if we, for example, look for term juditio, right, in Latin, would we see difference between first and second analytica?
No, so there the answer is simple. In the whole of organon, apophasis does not occur at all in the categoriae. It does occur some 5 or 10 times in the De Interpretatione. Then it does not occur in Analytica Priora. There is one place with many question marks after it because the manuscripts are so uncertain there that it's of no value. So let's say that there is none in Analytica Priora. Then there are the 3 in Analytica Posteriora and the none in the topics or the Sophisticis Elenchis.
Is there any suggestion that, I mean, I'm trying to link protasis to zetasis. It's something that played a role in zetasis, all right? And it seems, in a way, this saying, asserting distinction that you mentioned here in some ways seems too suggestive to me. I mean, so someone now drawing a distinction between a role that a judgment will play in an investigation versus a role that a hypothesis will play in an investigation. Was there some kind of interpretive divide here? And one set of readers emphasized the hypothetical, the role of the hypothesis in investigation. The other part emphasized the role of a judgment in investigation.
Yeah, now you are touching on a very important point, namely that Aristotle's logic, I mean his syllogistics, was a system of natural deduction in modern terms, as was found out as late as in the early 70s by Corcoran and Smiling. So Aristotle's syllogisms start not only from things which are already given or established, but they also start from assumptions. And that is in contradistinction to Plato, I mean what Plato says about the deductive method, for instance. And Aristotle refers to Zenon for reasoning from assumptions. And that's more or less the starting point of Aristotle's logic too.
But there's no, there's kind of no textual divide between those who take the hukum, say in the Arabic text, those who take the hukum rendition versus those who take the Qadi, I don't know how to pronounce these names at all. The judging versus saying tradition. I mean, is that embodied in a textual division too? If you have these texts, they treat it one way. If you have those texts, they treat it another.
Not that I know of, but should ask the experts here in Paris.
I never thought to.
Giuseppe asked you a question about the relation of the notion of between the notion of judgment as you presented here and the notion of judgment in intuitionistic type theory. And I have the feeling that in intuitionistic type theory, the notion of judgment is slightly more linguistic than it is as you presented here. For instance, here it's an act of judging, while in intuitionistic type theory, a judgment is something we can write down on a, for instance. So when you said you had to choose a word to make a distinction between proposition and this new thing, was the word sequent a possible competitor to judgment?
Yeah, sequent could have been used also, but sequent was also introduced by Gentzen as a meta-mathematical term. So if we took away from it all meta-mathematical connotations, but then we should also go back to consequence rather than sequence. And then seemed to me that certain judgments are consequence judgments, but it would be unnatural to call every judgment a consequence. So that's the reason for my choice. But I could also add something here, since it's related to what you brought up. Namely the question of whether to choose judgment or assertion. Well, suppose that you accept the standard view of distinguishing them, namely that assertion is the verbal thing that, as you said, we can write down on paper and type on our computers, whereas judgment is for the mental. Well, then we are in an unfortunate situation, because as logicians, we don't care about what medium we use, if it is the mental medium or the spoken medium or the written medium, or as now with the computer systems, we make our demonstrations in the computerized medium. Because the laws are the same. That's the big discovery of logic. And hence, if we were to stick to this traditional way of associating judgment with the mental and assertion with the verbal, then we have no good term, because we don't want to make that decision. And so then the choice that I made in the late 70s was to say assertion or judgment quite indifferently, that is, to allow both to be used for either the mental or the verbal if you're interested for some reason in one or the other. But what we really would like as logicians is one term which does not associate one way or the other. And there is no such term. Yeah.
Is this Arabic term kadia that you rendered as saying, does that mark a distinction between saying in the sense of uttering and saying in the sense of asserting?
No, so I did not associate kadia with saying. What I associated with saying was kaul. And there is something with the stems there which maybe correspond, but so.
Does it mark a distinction between saying in the sense of producing an utterance versus saying in the sense of producing an assertion?
Yes, so just kaul means saying. It could be any kind of saying.
So uttering.
Yes, right. I mean, it could be an imperative or an interrogative or anything. But if you want the declarative sentence, then the term was kaul Yazin, something like this, I believe. So, declarative sentence with the correspondence in Syriac that I wrote over there. And
I have a question about it also about prothesis. Does Proclus use prothesis, the term prothesis, when he gives this analysis of the problem and theory?
yes.
And if I understand correctly, at least if he would, I don't know, type theory, he had to say judgment probably, right? Also use this apophansis rather than prothesis. So
Yes.
what?
Yeah, so I mean, now you are touching the worst terminological problem that we have to live with as logicians, to my mind, namely the many different, not only two, many different senses of proposition, propositio. And I have stuck consistently now to one meaning, namely that propositions are the things that we combine with the connectives and the quantifiers. We also need propositional functions. So that is one well-defined way of using it. And we have no other term there that could be an alternative. So let's fix that for proposition. Then we have the proposition as it occurs in mathematics when we say proposition, démonstration. That is not just a proposition in the first sense, it's a whole assertion in that case. And so we could solve that problem by using the term assertion there, but who would like to see Bourbaki and all these beautiful texts in the history of mathematics with new words? It's impossible. So we now have two quite distinct senses, and then we have, especially in French, in particular in French, we have the linguistic use of proposition. So declarative sentence in the French school grammar, I thought, was proposition affirmative. Totally bad. Because first of all, it's proposition, and if we need proposition in logic for this, we should change it to phrase or something so that we don't mix things up. And then affirmative, no good, because we need affirmation and denial in logic, and we must have something which comprises both affirmation and denial, so we should say phrase assertive or phrase enunciative. So the problem is that we have the three areas of logic, mathematics, and ordinary grammar, school grammar, and proposition is used in different senses in these three areas.
To judge in the legal sense, it's not simply to say yes and no, but it's also to apply generality to a particular case. And that seems to be an obvious connection between the legal and the logical sense. And I wonder whether you took it into account in what you said about however it's pronounced.
Now, I agree completely that this analogy or connection between the logical and the juridical goes further than just this single term judgment, because after all we speak about the logical laws, so we have the term law in both areas, and we have the term sentence in declarative sentence, like judgment. Yes, there is a closer tie there.
The subject-predicate structure might have something to do with how the judge applies the law to a particular case. Don't you believe?
perhaps not the subject-predicate structure, but as the judge applies the law to a particular case, a logician applies a certain inference law to a particular case.
Well,
There are no more questions. Thank you very much.